Some years ago, a police officer showed up at my office. It turns out that he'd been among those who had responded to the sudden death of a beloved parishioner. He's a former marketing director in his 80s, and his wife was alone at home. And could I please come and stay with her until the funeral home took his body away and her children arrived? And as I drove over, it was jarring to see that everywhere else life was just moving on. The school buses making their last stops of the morning, an electrician's van outside of a neighbor's house, the flurry of activity I left at the church. But where I was headed, time was stopped, fractured. The widow, and it was impossible to use that word for her just yet, she now had no view of the future, no understanding of the after that she was now living in. We sat mostly in silence, sometimes recounting again the suddenness, the sadness, the desire that what had come to pass might not be so. We sat always with this longing that God might be affected by the things that affect us. Somehow, on that sad day, the opening of hope within our grief was that God's heart might be broken just like ours. As Isaiah writes today, Cyrus the Great of Persia has conquered the Babylonians, the ones who had conquered the kingdom of Judah. And as the dust settles, Cyrus will send back some of the exiled Jews in order that they might rebuild Jerusalem and its temple. And one can imagine the exiles, the stories of their parents and grandparents of the ascent to Jerusalem on the holy days, and the stories of the fall and of the deportation, all of it ringing in their ears as they crest the mountain and finally take in the devastation and ruin of their holy city. Their gasps, oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. The exiles demanding that the heavens mirror the fracturing of their own lives. That heaven's splintering might hold back the fragmentation, the utter meaningless that threatened to engulf them. That in the silent fragmentation of their lives, they might hear the splintering of God's own heart. When Mark records Jesus' kind of terrifying words, it's likely that he's already seen the ruins of Jerusalem. To Mark's community, Jesus' words are not predictions. They are observations of the terror that they had lived through. Jesus' words describe the splintering of their lives. Knowing the season and keeping alert was the same wise advice that any of them would pass on to their children. The traumatic reasoning of those who have been decimated by the wheels of empire. How they too longed for the heavens to tear open, to expose Christ's return that would set to right all that had been wrecked, for evidence that God had not abandoned them and grieved all that had befallen them. In her viral New York Times op-ed about her non-curable cancer, Kate Bowler wrote, "A tragedy is like a fault line. A life is split into a before and an after, and most of the time the before was better." I can't think of a person in this room who cannot say amen to that gospel. Cancer, miscarriage, job loss, a tornado ravages a town, depression, war descends, each a fault line ripping into our lives, a tearing of our realities, a split in the timeline of how we thought our lives would go, and the before really was better, and the after that we imagined was far superior to this. Bowler goes on to write, few people will let you admit that out loud. Sometimes those who love you best will skip that first horrible step of saying, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry this is happening to you. Interestingly, she says that it's hope that lets people skip that first step, but I think that there is no hope without that step. Hope is not the perfect word of comfort, but the silence that assures us you are seen. You are not alone. Hope can only happen when we know our fractured lives are mirrored by God's own torn open heart. That there might be a chasm in the heaven that echoes the chasm in our lives, the image like an hourglass, each rending meeting in the center, that moment in time so significant. And I think it is the incarnation, where God's broken, open heart acts to repair our own. But we can't skip ahead. The rending, the tearing, the breaking of God's heart comes first. That is the heart. That's the center of hope, the profound acknowledgement of our deepest sorrow and grief and regret. It is entirely possible, beloved, that this is what we have to offer one another this holiday season and every season, really. Our own broken hearts that mirror God's own. Amen.